Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Michael Rubin, Director of Policy Analysis at the Middle East Forum and Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, join us to discuss Red Sea security and the Houthi challenge. Mr. Rubin will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Michael Rubin.
Thank you very much, Stacey. I'm a historian, so I get paid to predict the past, and admittedly, I only get that right about half the time. But just some background on the current crisis, why it's important, and then I'm going to conclude by talking about the Iranian fingerprints on this. When we talk about the Houthis are actually a tribal group. The religious group is called the Zaydis. They're a type of Shia, but they're a type of Shiite who are different than what we would find in Lebanon, Iraq, or Iran. In Iran, they're called Twelvers, meaning they have 12 imams. In Yemen, with the Zaydis or the Houthis, they go back to only the fifth imam, and so their theology is fundamentally different. The bottom line up front is, if you are a Houthi, you are Shia, but you're about as close to Sunnism theologically as you can be without actually being Sunni. Now, here's what basically happened. While in 2009, according to a United Nations report, there was an interception of Iranian weaponry going to the Houthis. Now, my own take on this is that the Iranians were very mindful of the American political calendar. We had just had a change in the White House, and they were testing the waters a little bit. And what they found was permissiveness. So the Houthis started accumulating weapons, and Yemen, of course, is not short of weapons itself. When I lived there back in 1995, I went to an arms market, and there were huge crates of weaponry, stamped property of the US government, which had been smuggled out of Iraq or Kuwait 4 years previously. At any rate, the Saudis, being sectarian as they can be, in northern Yemen, set up loudspeakers basically to harass the Houthi villagers with sectarian propaganda. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and this is something that dates back to Bernard Lewis, when you have mountainous, inhospitable terrain, that's where you actually get a lot of the minorities. So the Houthis, basically the Shiite offshoot, were a minority, but they also lived in the same neighborhood as the Yemeni Jews did, centered around a town called Sada, which was between Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and the Saudi border. When I was a student, I went around that area before the final flight of Yemeni Jews, and so I would meet Yemeni Jews and I would meet Houthis, sometimes even in the same villages. At any rate, the Iranians never let a good opportunity go to waste. And so when the Saudis started with their sectarian propaganda, the Iranians responded by organizing the Houthis. Now, another thing I do in my spare time is oftentimes around Thanksgiving, I'll go to Iraq as a guest of the Chief of Staff to Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani. And I'm in the shrine cities in Najaf and Karbala, and I'll be meeting with Ayatollahs there just to do my normal analytical work for the Middle East Forum and for the American Enterprise Institute. And when you meet with an Ayatollah, they're in a room, you're sitting down next to them in a small room, and then they have their students there and anyone else who's waiting to meet with them. And in a way, it can be like a session with Yoda from Star Wars. It's not clear, and you're talking in riddles and that sort of thing. But then you go into the next room, and usually the Ayatollah's eldest son will have a discussion with you to make sure you draw the right conclusions. The point of this, however, was as I was going around Najaf and Karbala, the delegation right behind me was a Houthi delegation. And so I would go from one Ayatollah to another, and then they would have the next meeting and so on. And what the Iraqi minders were saying was, you know, these Houthis are so desperate for Iranian support. They're trying to learn real Shiism right now, although there is an open question about whether it was too little, too late. At any rate, that sort of just shows you sort of the interplay where the Iranians are taking this opportunity. The question is whether the Houthis are more important to Iran than Iran is to the Houthis. And this is the issue that confused a lot of American policymakers who don't want to see Iranian fingerprints all over, because if you have accountability, then that's going to lead to policy recommendations which many people are afraid of. Specifically, if you find Iran guilty of being a rogue regime, you have to deal with it. And the State Department, unfortunately, is very good at self-deception. Now, Iran denied involvement in Yemen for a long time, but at the same time, when you look at Iranian rhetoric, they refer to Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, as the fourth Iranian capital. The other ones, of course, being Baghdad, Beirut, and Damascus. U.S. ships have intercepted Iranian ships with aid for Houthi forces. But, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll look at the rhetoric coming out of these countries themselves. In January of 2015, you had Ali Shirazi, who was the supreme leader of Iran's representative to the Quds force. That's the main sort of force charged with terrorism. That was the force that was led by Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in a U.S. strike in January 2020. What Ali Shirazi said is, and I quote, "The Houthis are a version of Hezbollah, and this group will use the stage for confronting the enemies of Islam." Talk about having a crystal ball. Unfortunately, too often we ignore what the Iranians themselves say. But after all, is Ali Shirazi someone we should listen to? Let's say the answer to that is no. Well, then let's turn to Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, someone who considers himself the deputy of the Messiah on earth. What he said in May 2015 is, "We will support every innocent and oppressed person. Today, the people of Yemen have been oppressed. There's no oppression which is more severe than killing Muslims in a haram month, a forbidden month. The month of Rajab, one of the Arabic months, is a haram month. Even the pagans in Mecca used to stop wars when the month of Rajab arrived. The people of Yemen are an oppressed people. The people of Bahrain are an oppressed people. The people of Palestine are subject to severe oppression. We support the oppressed as much as we can. We support them within the scope of our capabilities because it is our responsibility to do so." When you have the supreme leader of Iran saying this, why is it that so many in the United States, and especially within our intelligence community, within the State Department, and elsewhere, will say, we just don't have a smoking gun? There's a couple things here. When it comes to Iran, the worst thing you can do is, as an analyst, is project our own understanding of the way the United States works upon Iran. Iran is a dictatorship, but it's a dictatorship of omission rather than commission. It's not a dictatorship like Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Kim Jong-un's North Korea. Instead of the dictator passing down commands through the ranks to a lower level, what you actually have is the dictator, in this case Ali Khamenei, telling people what they can't do. And whatever he doesn't expressly forbid, you are allowed to do it. Now, here's the problem. When there is an episode in which, for example, there's a terrorist attack, a ship is struck by a drone, something like that, it's natural to want to look for the smoking gun in intelligence. And the president, whoever that may be, will go to the Central Intelligence Agency or the National Security Agency and say, "Can you find anything in the intercepts about this?" But we're never going to find a smoking gun because there's never going to be a direct order. There's only going to be what the Iranians have told people they couldn't do. And so ordinary Iranians, the Quds Force, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, have a tremendous ability to do and to act on their own accord. It's a separate culture of command than we would have in almost any other dictatorship. Now, how come the Houthis have gotten to this point where they're disrupting shipping in a location through which 9% of the seaborne oil transits? And they risk the entirety of the Suez Canal as well, through which 11% transits. And by the way, some of Israel's own gas and oil transit this route. And behind the scenes, there are many people very, very nervous about whether what the Houthis are doing is meant to sort of slowly starve Israel of its fuel to continue to be the startup nation. Now, why hasn't this been dealt with? It looked for a time like the United Arab Emirates would do it. One of the big ports in Yemen is called Hodeidah. And I gotta say, next to Peshawar in Pakistan, it's the most miserable city in which I have ever been. But putting that aside, when you look at, and I've been to Camden, New Jersey before, but putting that aside, when you go to Hodeidah, that was basically the main port through which so much of this weaponry shipped over from Iran would flow. And the Emiratis were about to seize Hodeidah. And of course, you had the usual human rights activists and agents of influence and others saying, you can't seize Hodeidah. Think of the humanitarian consequences, a parallel to what we're seeing right now with Rafah. But well, the United Arab Emirates were actually thinking of going in, and I was actually thinking of going onto one of their command boats to watch the operation. But then what happened, and you guys may remember this, is you had some ships at the United Arab Emirates port of Khor Fakkan, which is just outside the Strait of Hormuz. And some ships were mined by the Iranians, and the implication was clear. You go into Hodeidah, and we're going to target your flank in the United Arab Emirates itself. And the United Arab Emirates reconsidered their operation, and they pulled out of the region. This is when the United Arab Emirates stopped actively fighting in Yemen. This is when they pulled out of their base in Somaliland, a place we can talk about again, perhaps in a future brief. At any rate, this basically left a vacuum. And unfortunately, one thing the United States consistently fails to recognize is when you have a vacuum, it's seldom the forces of altruism which fill it. So what are we doing now? I mean, basically, the Biden administration is using the Navy in order to escort ships. I would argue this isn't going to work. I think what's in Biden's mind or that of his advisors is we had an anti-piracy operation off the coast of Somalia during the Obama administration, and that was largely successful. The problem is when you're in the deep blue water, 100 miles from shore, you don't have to worry about drones and speedboats and that sort of thing. But the Bab al-Mandab, the strategic choke point, is narrower than the Missouri River is at its widest. You're vulnerable to any sorts of things. And when you have U.S. ships, as some of you know, I used to teach for the U.S. Navy on board deployed carriers and so forth. A U.S. Navy ship has to spend as much time in port undergoing maintenance as it does at sea. So this is a tremendous drain on our resources. Perhaps the best analogy to what we're doing right now in the Red Sea is what the Reagan administration did with regard to reflagging the Kuwaiti tankers in the Persian Gulf back in 1987 and 1988. But remember, that ended in April 1988 in a military confrontation with Iran, Operation Praying Mantis. There's that old joke, why does the Iranian Navy have glass-bottom boats so they can see their Air Force? The point is, are we prepared to take this to the next level and restore deterrence? I would argue at the very least what we need to do is use Somaliland. It's sort of like the Iraqi Kurdistan of Somalia. It's been at peace since 1991. I even took my 9-year-old daughter there a couple years ago. And while it takes 4,000 men at least to crew an aircraft carrier, it only takes 4 men to crew an Osprey. That's one of those planes that takes off like a helicopter and then transforms into a plane. And you can patrol a much wider region of the area. But we've got to put to the rest this notion that the Houthis are just, a Yemeni group that's not operating on behalf of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We've got to put to rest our wishful thinking, target the Houthis, because the more we are put to flight by groups like the Houthis that we wouldn't have thought twice about, the more that all these other groups in the region that are going to think, if the Houthis can do it, if the Taliban can do it, if al-Shabaab can do it, then we can do it too. Until we restore deterrence, we're setting the United States up for a disaster. What happens in the Bab al-Mandab doesn't stay in the Bab al-Mandab. And with that, why don't I turn the floor back over to Stacy so that I can take your questions?
All right, thank you so much. So the first question we have is from David Levine asking or stating, excellent discussion. I'm intrigued that Ayatollahs and other extreme Muslim leaders would meet with you, a Jewish academic who works with the Middle East Forum. Could you say a few words about that?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'll start by saying that I interned um, for Patrick Clausen and Daniel Pipes right when the Middle East Forum was being founded 30 years ago. I hate to admit my age in that way, but I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia. I was taking summer school at the University of Pennsylvania, and so interning for Daniel Pipes at the time was a natural way in order to pursue my interests. Now, um, I was very fortunate not only to have Daniel. Well, first of all, let me just tell you a story. I applied for all sorts of internships and I didn't hear back from anything. So eventually I got desperate. This is my sophomore year in college, and I called up Patrick Clausen, who's a friend of the Middle East Forum. And Patrick said, "Oh, I'm so glad you called. I had lost your application. I was trying to reach you. But would you work for me as my intern?" And he described himself as a former World Bank economist. And I said, "But look, I haven't taken a single economics class." And Patrick said, "That's exactly why I wanted to hire you, so I won't have to bother on teaching all the crap they teach in universities." And then that's how I actually got to know Daniel as well. But Daniel infused in me a type of realism and approach to looking at the region, which I hadn't really got at the university. And at the same time, I got to say, I was fortunate to start my career in an age before Google became widespread, so that I was able to go around without people necessarily checking my writings all the time. As it is right now, they have checked my writings, and while I'm still welcome in Iraq, I'm banned in Iran, I'm banned in Russia, I'm banned in China, I'm banned in Turkey, and I'm banned in Azerbaijan as well as Eritrea. So I got to say, at least I'm getting banned by the right people.
Absolutely. Thank you. So you talked about deterrence there. So what exact measures would you like to see the United States take for deterrence?
Okay, well, first of all, the thing to understand about deterrence isn't just a rhetorical strategy. If we use deterrence as a rhetorical strategy and someone calls our bluff, then ultimately we lose that deterrence. I'd argue this is the mistake of President Obama when he laid down the red line with regard to chemical weapons in Syria about a decade ago. At any rate, when it comes to deterrence, I would argue that number one, that terrorism is a tactic, and it's a tactic that's applied as part of a cost benefit analysis. If the groups which are sponsoring terrorism thinks that the cost of that terrorism is is less than the advantages they get from using it, they're going to utilize the terrorism. Now, when we consider that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps supports the Houthis, I would argue that first and foremost, the core of deterrence needs to be to target the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, not necessarily in Iran itself, because that would allow the Iranians to the regime to rally people around the flag, but overseas. If they're going to target Americans, why shouldn't we target the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps? Only when they determine we're serious are they going to think twice about what the red lines are. They're going to keep pushing until someone pushes back, and it behooves us, therefore, to push back. Another way to look at this is deterrence is just as much psychological as it is military. We don't have to respond every time, but we have to have that shadow of a doubt. And years ago, I asked General Chuck Wald, who was the retired U.S. Air Force general who led the initial air campaign on Afghanistan after 9/11. In the context of Iran, I asked him what deterrence was, what containment was. He defined containment as the ability of all the states in the region to wage war independently with Iran until the cavalry could come in, meaning the United States. And he defined deterrence in the case of Iran, and this is in the backdrop of a discussion with regard to the nuclear issue, as the willingness to kill 2 or 3 million Iranians. If we downplay exactly what deterrence means, then we lose all sorts of deterrence. And I should say that when Iranian ships, those small boats, those speedboats, buzz American ships in the Persian Gulf, they often unfurl banners talking about how the Americans can't do a damn thing. But I'll let you know that after Ronald Reagan launched Operation Praying Mantis, the Iranians were quiet for quite some time. what we need to have a discussion about is how do we calibrate this deterrence so that the Iranians hurt, so that they pull back from targeting us, and so that they maintain their quiet.
Thank you. Lise Cornson asks, besides retaking Hadea and patrolling the Somaliland with Ospreys, don't we also need to stabilize Yemen, support the STC, restrict Houthis funding by banning cash support via the UN, follow advice on Yemen from M. Knights and N. Dasawi?
Okay. It's a great question, Lisa. Lise, sorry, Corson. Um, Basically, look, I don't see the United Nations as a solution to any problem. I see the United Nations as keeping open wounds open in order to, at the very least, maintain that problem. I'm not trying to be conspiratorial. It's just the nature of the beast, the nature of the bureaucracy, and the fact that you have so many conflicting interests in the United Nations. I would say that Yemen has never been stable. The fact of the matter is, when you go to the history of Yemen, and again, I used to live in Yemen, um, people talk about whether, I mean, some of you remember North Yemen and South Yemen from the Cold War, but people talk about the natural divisions in Yemen are perhaps there's 6 of them. But if you talk to other scholars, they talk about how maybe there's 30 of them. Yemen is a lot like Afghanistan, not only topographically, but also tribally. My own rule of thumb when it comes to Yemen would be this. You stabilize what you can stabilize to deny that space to those that would fill the vacuum with something other than altruism. Therefore, I don't understand why we don't do more to consolidate our own interests with regard to South Yemen, which has effectively split away. It was once a Soviet vassal. It has very little to do with North Yemen culturally, and it controls the strategic waterway. Now, Hodeidah is actually part of North Yemen historically, but there's no reason why we couldn't encourage others, including the Southerners, to go into Hodeidah or at least block transit through the Hodeidah port to the Houthis. The other group we need to lean hard against is the Sultanate of Oman. Now, a lot of people love the Sultanate of Oman, and under Sultan Qaboos, it's neutral. It's neither Sunni nor Shia. It's actually a group called the Abadi. It's like Yemen with infrastructure. You feel like, I mean, it's just as a traveler, it's an amazing vacation. But the problem is that Oman has been giving safe haven to the Houthis in the same way that Qatar has with the Taliban or with Hamas. A think tank delegation went a few years ago to Muscat, the capital of Oman, to meet with the Houthis. And one person asked them this question: what about your slogan, death to America, death to Israel, curse all the Jews? And what do you make of this? And the spokesman of the Houthis said, well, that's our program. I mean, again, we've got to take people at their word. But Oman has been, put it this way, I saw a lot of arms when I lived in Yemen, but there weren't a lot of anti-ship missiles. Those anti-ship missiles are getting in from someplace, and unfortunately, that someplace often is through Oman. So, I mean, we got to realize that not all of our so-called allies are on the same page as we are. We have a growing problem when it comes to Oman, and I would also say towards Kuwait itself.
Thank you. Carrie Hillebrand asks, could you speculate as to what the US and possibly UK response would be if the Houthis succeeded in actually sinking a vessel or at least causing a mass casualty event?
Um, Here's my problem. As an analyst, whether it comes to drone attacks on American bases, attacks on US or British shipping, or ballistic missile launches, I hate when I hear a sigh of relief from people in Washington that, oh, these guys missed, or that missile launch was a failure. Because you can learn just as much from a failure as you can learn from a success. And if you wait long enough, you're just asking for trouble. When you kick the can down the road, you got to recognize that road is going to end. So if you have a mass casualty event, and remember, the USS Cole, which was pulling out of Aden, not too far away from the Bab al-Mandab, back in, I believe it was May of 2000, when it was set upon by an Al-Qaeda suicide speedboat. I think it killed 17 people or so. And the fact of the matter is, we would respond. The question is, wouldn't it be more responsible to respond to these nests before they can actually kill Americans rather than wait until they can kill Americans? And again, I go back to what I said before, that if you're going to target the advisors, then the advisors are going to think twice about what they're doing. If you target the transfer of missiles, including on Iranian boats, well, then those Iranian ship captains are going to think twice about what they're doing. I think we need to be much more proactive than reactive.
Thank you. You spoke about how we can't actually prove that Iran is sending any direct orders because they're not. How exactly do you think the U.S. lawmakers, decision makers can confront this without that definitive proof?
Okay. Um, First of all, we need to recognize that we're not operating in a court of law. And therefore, we have to understand that in the world of intelligence and in the world of the military, there's a difference between evidence as would be in a courtroom and so-called definitive proof and the preponderance of evidence that we might use. We need to not project ourselves onto our adversaries in this way. You know, a few years ago for the National Counterterrorism Center, I did a study in which I looked at all these episodes of so-called rogue behavior on the part of Iran, where they had done something very bad, including, for example, the 1994 bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires. And then people speculated, diplomats speculated, you know, this was actually just a rogue operation. We can't hold the entirety of the Iranian government responsible. When you look at each of those episodes, the person who was the perpetrator, the person who was the ringleader who planned the operation, invariably got promoted after the fact, which suggests that it wasn't a rogue operation. But when I was talking to the National Counterterrorism Center, they said, you know, that actually doesn't mean anything because they might have just figured it's the path of least resistance in order to in order to not create waves after this rogue operation. So then I looked at a bunch of other rogue operations which truly were rogue, and the perpetrators in those cases were actually executed inside Iran, which suggests that when you get a promotion, you're actually working on behalf of what the Iranians want. When you have the head of the Quds force or the supreme leader's representative to the Quds force speaking on behalf of supporting the Houthis, you know, we need to take them at their word.
Absolutely. And you spoke about this, the Houthis targeting the shipping lanes in the Red Sea as possibly trying to reduce the oil coming into Israel. How do we see this playing into what's happening in Israel right now with the Gaza Hamas-Israel war?
Well, first of all, I would have to defer a lot of those questions to Greg Roman, who knows a lot more about Israel per se than I do. I tend to focus on the enemy countries, and it's part of the network that Daniel and Greg have put together at Middle East Forum that we all have sort of complementary interests. That said, the Iranians, I follow Iranian military rhetoric for the Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And they once talked about themselves as a regional power. Then about 10 years ago, they started talking about themselves as a pan-regional power, meaning the Persian Gulf and the Northern Indian Ocean. Now they define their strategic boundaries as the Eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf of Aden. And so at the very least, we're looking at the encirclement of Israel. And whether that encirclement is right on Israel's border, it's not, with regard to Jordan and Saudi Arabia, or simply along the strategic choke points, it's six and one half dozen of another in terms of ultimate economic impact on Israel. At some point, you got to push back. Otherwise, the stranglehold is simply going to continue.
Absolutely. And we have one last question here from Lise Corson. Biden is afraid of targeting the IRGC, but Israel isn't. Now what?
Okay. Well, the fact of the matter is, the fact that Israel isn't is something that plays into, I mean, that creates deterrence. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen in the next election. Um, if Donald Trump wins, at the very least, there's a great deal of uncertainty in the region simply because he was the one that ordered the strike on Qasem Soleimani, who was long thought to be untouchable. So you do have some element of deterrence out there. And of course, as Carrie had said, if there is a great enough strike, you might have even the Biden administration shift its tack to a much more direct approach. Of course, the elephant in the room is that Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, is 85 years old, I believe, and in ill health. And if he dies, the whole situation is up for grabs. We can't assume that today's status quo is going to be tomorrow's status quo.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of our webinar or podcast. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today.
Thank you.
For our viewers, please join us Friday, February 16th, for a podcast with Dexter Van Zyl starting at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.